Orphaned. Passage 1, William. 1983, Lancaster City, Pennsylvania. The neon glow of the old Willow Lane's bowling alley flickered against the damp pavement as a cold breeze rolled through the quiet streets of Lancaster City. The hum of a distant street lamp buzzed in the stillness of the night, illuminating the modest row homes that lined Duke Street, their brick facades soaked in the warm orange light of a time before the city's decline. It was an era of cassette tapes, quarter-fed arcade machines, and late-night television static, a time before the nightmares began. Johnny Vanduke was 9 years old. Too old to be scared of the dark, but too young to ignore the way the house creaked at night. His home, a 2-story townhouse near the edge of the city, was alive in the way old houses always were, pipes groaning, wind rattling the loose window panes, the faint, almost rhythmic sound of something shifting in the attic. His mother always said it was just the house settling. Tonight, he wasn't so sure. Lying in bed, tangled in a pile of twisted Star Wars bedsheets, Johnny stared at the ceiling, his mind wandering to the flickering hallway light that his mother had forgotten to turn off. The light was moving. No, something was casting a shadow. At first, it was just a shape, an odd, shifting silhouette against the wall, barely perceptible in the dim glow. It was a slow and deliberate movement, almost as if something was just outside his bedroom door, just out of sight. He swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the blanket like a lifeline. Maybe it's Mom. He turned onto his side, facing the doorway. The hallway stretched into darkness beyond the flickering light, its usual comfort now feeling ominous. The air was heavy, thick with something wrong. Then, as if the universe had decided to test his nerve, the hallway light clicked off. Darkness swallowed the room whole. Johnny's breath hitched. He squeezed his eyes shut, telling himself it was just the old wiring, just a coincidence, just the house settling. But the sound outside his door, the faintest, almost imperceptible click of something tapping against the hardwood floor, said otherwise. A step. Then another. No, 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 his mind raced. It's nothing. It's nothing. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. He felt frozen, his body locked in place, muscles stiff as if they belonged to a mannequin. Then silence. The noise stopped. The house was still. Seconds dragged into minutes, and finally, Johnny cracked one eye open, peering cautiously into the pitch-black void of his room. Nothing. No shapes, no figures looming in the doorway, no monsters waiting in the dark. Just silence. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe. A whisper. Not words, not something recognizable, just a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. And then the tapping resumed. But this time, it was inside the room. Johnny's heart stopped. It was soft, barely audible, like fingers drumming against wood. But it was there, definitely there, just beyond the foot of his bed. Something was in the room. He couldn't move. He wouldn't move. The moment he moved, he knew whatever it was, it would see him. A slow creak echoed from the floorboards. Whatever it was shifting, repositioning, watching, waiting, and then silence. For what felt like an eternity, Johnny lay there, unmoving, unbreathing, listening. Then, as if the presence had never been there at all, the hallway light flickered back on. A faint hum of electricity filled the silence. And the house was still again. Johnny finally allowed himself to breathe, chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow bursts. His fingers were still clutched around the blanket, his knuckles white. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, over a bowl of sugary cereal, he casually asked his mother if she had come into his room last night. She frowned. "No, honey. I was asleep." "Why?" He hesitated, spoon clinking against the ceramic bowl. "No reason." Because Johnny knew. If it wasn't his mother, then who or what had been in his room? And why did it feel like, whatever it was, it wasn't done watching him? The bell above the door of Freddy's pizza place jingled as Johnny pushed his way inside, the rush of warm, greasy air smacking him in the face. The arcade machines hummed, their blinking lights reflecting off the checkered tile floor. The smell of artificial cheese and stale pepperoni filled his nostrils as he took a few steps inside, his sneakers sticking slightly to the floor. It wasn't his first time here. Freddy's was one of those places where kids went to lose track of time. Parents dumped their kids off at birthday parties, teenagers huddled around a pinball machine in the corner, and toddlers screamed in delight as the animatronic band played another loop of its tired, off-key song. But tonight, something felt different. Johnny glanced toward the main stage, where Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, and Chica the Chicken stood frozen in their eternal concert stance. Their plastic eyes glowed eerily beneath the dim lighting, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn Bonnie's head had twitched ever so slightly. He blinked. The rabbit stood still. Just the usual tricks of the light, he told himself. His best friend, Mikey, waved him over from the skee-ball machines. "Dude, where the hell were you?" Mikey said, stuffing another token into the slot. "You missed it?" Some kid threw up in the ball pit, and it was disgusting. Johnny managed a weak laugh, but his eyes kept flicking back toward the animatronics. Something about them felt wrong. He couldn't explain it. The way Freddy's plastic grin seemed wider than before. The way Bonnie's head definitely wasn't facing that direction a second ago. The way the entire restaurant felt too quiet beneath the hum of arcade noises. Johnny swallowed hard. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe. Or maybe something was waking up. And maybe it had been watching him long before he ever set foot in Freddy's. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 p.m. The restaurant was closing soon. The staff would go home. And the lights would go off. And whatever was inside those animatronics wouldn't be sleeping. The glow of the neon pizza sign buzzed above Johnny Vanduke as he stood outside Freddy's pizza place. The cold night air nipped at his nose, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of the restaurant behind him. He should have gone home. Mikey and the others had left almost an hour ago, their pockets emptied of tokens, their parents honking in the parking lot to drag them away. But Johnny had lingered, pretending to struggle with his shoelaces near the counter, watching as the last few families shuffled out, one by one. He wasn't sure why he stayed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. Through the restaurant's front window, the animatronics stood frozen on stage, locked in their programmed poses, their lifeless plastic eyes staring at the empty dining area. Even in stillness, they looked wrong. Freddy's head tilted slightly downward, his half-lidded gaze locked toward the floor. Chica's beak was parted, just enough to show her dull, blocky teeth. Bonnie's hands rested on his guitar, but his fingers were curled too tightly around the neck, like he was gripping it rather than playing it. It wasn't them, though. It was the way the place felt. Hollow. Like a house long abandoned, where laughter used to live but had long since rotted away. Johnny exhaled, pressing his hands into the pockets of his jacket. He wasn't supposed to be out this late. His mom would kill him if she knew. But still his feet didn't move. Through the glass, he spotted a man near the front counter, talking in hushed tones to one of the employees. He was tall, dressed neatly, with pressed sleeves and a company name tag clipped to his shirt. Johnny recognized him. William Afton. One of the guys who ran the place. He wasn't the owner, that was some other guy, Henry something, but Afton was always around, usually talking to the workers, messing with the animatronics. Johnny had never spoken to him, but something about the man put a weight in his stomach. Maybe it was the way he moved, calm, measured, almost too smooth. Or maybe it was his smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. Afton nodded to the worker, patting him on the shoulder before heading toward the back office. The worker, a teenage guy in a red apron, watched him go, something uneasy flickering across his face. Then he looked toward the window. Right at Johnny. Johnny quickly turned away, shoving his hands deeper into his pockets. He needed to go home. Now. As he stepped off the curb, a sound prickled at the back of his ears, soft, barely a whisper against the night air. A voice. Not words. Just a hum. A tune. Slow. Familiar. Mechanical. Johnny froze. It was coming from inside the restaurant. His breath hitched. The lights were dimmed, the doors locked, the restaurant closed. The animatronics weren't supposed to move when no one was there. But as Johnny glanced over his shoulder, just for a second, Freddy's head wasn't looking at the floor anymore. It was looking at him. The hum stopped. Johnny ran. The cold air bit at Johnny's face as he ran. His sneakers slapped against the cracked pavement, the rhythm matching the frantic beat of his pulse. He didn't stop, not even to look back. When he reached his house, the porch light was still on, but the windows were dark. His mother must have fallen asleep waiting for him. He fumbled with the lock, nearly dropping his key before shoving the door open and slipping inside. The house was quiet. Too quiet. He shut the door behind him and pressed his back against it, his chest rising and falling with each heavy breath. His mind was a tangle of thoughts, none of them making sense. Freddy had moved. No. No, that was ridiculous. That wasn't possible. The animatronics didn't just move on their own. Right? He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to think rationally. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe a weird shadow through the window. Maybe one of the workers had been inside, adjusting the animatronics, and he just thought he had seen something. But the sound, that low, mechanical hum, that wasn't his imagination. His legs ached as he pushed himself off the door and crept toward the stairs. He winced as the old wood groaned beneath his weight, careful not to wake his mother. Once in his room, he shut the door behind him and flicked on the lamp beside his bed. The soft glow made everything feel smaller, safer. He sat on the edge of his mattress, staring down at his hands. They were trembling. He let out a breath and flopped back onto the bed, staring at the ceiling. It didn't matter. Tomorrow, everything would feel normal again. It had to. The next day, Johnny kept his mouth shut. At school, Mikey rambled on about some new arcade game at the mall, oblivious to the way Johnny's mind was elsewhere. "You good, man?" Mikey asked, popping a potato chip into his mouth. "Yeah," Johnny lied, picking at the crust of his sandwich. "Cool, so we're still going to Freddy's later, right?" Johnny's stomach turned. "Freddy's?" Mikey snorted. "Yeah, dude. Friday night. Best night for the arcade. Unless you're scared or something." Johnny scoffed, shoving his sandwich into his mouth to buy time. "Scared? No. Not really." But the thought of going back there made his skin itch. The hum. The movement. Afton. His gaze flickered to the clock above the lunchroom doors. 5 hours until Freddy's. By the time they arrived at the pizzeria, the scent of hot cheese and stale soda filled the air. The place was packed. Kids ran between arcade cabinets, screaming. Toddlers yanked at their parents' hands, and birthday parties crammed into booths covered in pizza crumbs. It felt normal. Johnny exhaled. Maybe he had imagined it. He followed Mikey to the arcade corner, slapping a few quarters onto the machine as they took turns playing Galaga. For the first time since last night, his mind settled. Until he saw Afton. The man was standing by the front counter, arms folded, watching. Not the customers. Not the employees. Johnny. Their eyes met for the briefest second before Afton smiled. A slow, easy smile, like they were in on some secret together. Johnny quickly turned back to the arcade screen, his fingers moving too fast over the buttons. He hadn't told anyone what he saw last night. So why did it feel like Afton already knew? The pizzeria was louder than usual. Balloons tied to chairs bobbed in the artificial breeze of ceiling fans, and the distinct sound of children's laughter mixed with the arcade's electronic chimes. Something was happening, something big. Johnny could feel it in the air. Mikey was too focused on the flashing lights of Street Fighter to notice, but Johnny's attention drifted toward the center of the restaurant, where a crowd had begun to gather. A birthday party. One bigger than usual. And at the heart of it, a boy sat stiffly at the table, hands balled into fists on his lap. His dark hair hung over his eyes, his small frame barely filling out his striped blue shirt. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The banner above read, "Happy birthday, Evan." Johnny hadn't seen him before. But something about the way the kid sat, shoulders hunched, body tensed like he was waiting for something to go wrong, Johnny recognized it. He knew that feeling. The one that made you small, that made you feel like you didn't belong, like you didn't want to be seen but couldn't escape the eyes on you. "Hey, you listening?" Johnny blinked, snapping his gaze back to Mikey, who was already shoving another quarter into the machine. "What's with you?" Mikey asked, raising an eyebrow. Johnny hesitated. "Nothing." He glanced back toward the party. A few kids were gathered around Evan's chair now. Older boys. One of them clamped a heavy hand on Evan's shoulder. Evan flinched. Johnny knew that feeling, too. The older boy, taller, smug, leaned in close, whispering something into Evan's ear. The younger boy's face twisted, his head jerking away like he was trying to shrink into himself. Johnny felt his stomach tighten. Then, an announcement crackled through the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, gather around for a very special birthday surprise. For the first time in years, straight from Fredbear's family diner, we welcome back the stars of the show, Fredbear and Spring Bonnie." A cheer erupted from the crowd. Parents clapped, kids screamed in delight. Johnny barely heard it. He was still watching Evan. The boy was frozen now, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. The older boys were laughing, teasing. Something was wrong. Then, they grabbed him. Evan barely had time to yelp before they hoisted him up, carrying him toward the stage like a prize. Johnny took a step forward. He didn't know why. He just knew something bad was about to happen. Evan thrashed, legs kicking, but they didn't let go. The biggest one, the one Johnny assumed was his older brother, grinned at the crowd, playing it off like a joke. "Come, Evan," Michael said, voice dripping with mockery. "It's your big day. You love Fredbear, don't you?" "No, stop." Evan struggled harder, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The crowd didn't seem to care. To them, it was just another part of the show. Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, bigger than the other animatronics, bulkier, older, stepped onto the stage. Their yellow suits gleamed under the colored lights, their painted-on smiles frozen in place. Fredbear's wide, open maw loomed just ahead. Michael and his friends laughed. The crowd cheered. Johnny's breath caught in his throat. Something in his gut screamed at him, "This is wrong." The lights. The laughter. The way the animatronic seemed to breathe, its jaw hanging loose, waiting. Michael turned to the crowd with a smirk. "Let's give him a big kiss." Then, before Johnny could do anything, they shoved Evan's head into Fredbear's mouth. The crowd was still laughing. Evan screamed. Then, a snap. The laughter stopped. A horrible, wet crunch. Silence. Then screaming. Not Evan's. The crowd's. Blood dripped onto the stage. Fredbear stood still, his jaw locked in place. Something inside had broken. And Evan wasn't moving. Johnny stumbled back, his stomach twisting, the world tilting. The crowd erupted into chaos. Parents pulled their kids away. Employees rushed forward. Michael was screaming now, too. Not laughing. Not anymore. Fredbear wouldn't let go. And Evan. His body twitched once. Then went still. The pizzeria was frozen in time. The noise, the laughter, the clinking of arcade machines, all of it had been swallowed by the horrible, deafening silence. The only sound was the slow, mechanical hum of Fredbear's internal servos, a low, grinding whir that barely masked the wet, dripping noise beneath it. Blood. Dark, viscous, pooling onto the checkered tiles in slow, heavy splatters. It ran down the golden fur of the animatronic's rigid jaw, seeping into the joints of its mouth, slicking its synthetic teeth in a fresh coat of deep, crimson red. It trickled in small, thin rivulets down Evan's forehead, threading through his matted hair, his small frame twitching like a marionette with its strings half cut. Fredbear's mouth should have opened. It should have let go. But it didn't. It stayed shut. Something had broken, something inside, something in the mechanisms, something in the way the servos had locked mid-motion, trapping the boy's skull inside just as it clenched down. Johnny couldn't breathe. His lungs locked, his feet felt cemented to the floor, but his eyes wouldn't look away. Evan's body trembled violently, his fingers curling in and out, bloodless and shaking. His legs jerked, kicking weakly, his sneakers scraping against the stage in a way that made Johnny's stomach churn. It wasn't the movement of someone trying to get free, it was the movement of dying. Michael had let go. He had stumbled backward, his face drained of color, his cocky smirk wiped clean, his hands shaking. He hadn't meant for this. He hadn't thought, hadn't believed. Fredbear had moved. He had reacted. And now Evan's head. CRKKK. A sick, wet pop echoed through the silent room, a sound too organic for something that was supposed to be an arcade show. Evan's body spasmed once. Hard. His arms flailed, his fingers gripping the fur of Fredbear's suit, pulling, clawing, trying to find something, anything to hold onto. His legs jerked outward, kicking against the stage floor, his small frame arching unnaturally before suddenly. His body sagged. His grip went slack. His fingers slid down, leaving small, smeared streaks of red across the dull yellow fur of Fredbear's chest. The mechanical hum whirred again, the servos failing to complete their cycle. The animatronic twitched, its jaw grinding as it attempted to release. A deep, guttural gurgle pushed out from Evan's throat. His mouth opened. A bubble of blood formed at his lips, then burst, trailing down his chin in a thin, crimson thread. The air was thick with the scent of iron. Michael screamed. Johnny flinched at the sound, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The crowd was finally moving, adults rushing forward, someone shouting for help, for a doctor, for anyone. But Johnny knew. He knew before anyone else did. Evan wasn't coming back. His body hung limp now, his eyes fluttering, wide and glassy, his small chest barely moving beneath his blood-stained sweater. His fingers twitched once, just once. Then, slowly, they stopped. Fredbear gave a final, jerking shudder. And then his jaw released. Evan crumpled. His head hit the stage with a dull, wet thump. His face. Johnny's stomach lurched. His skull was cracked. Not like a clean break, not like something that could be patched with stitches and a hospital visit. It was caved in. A deep, concave indent where Fredbear's mechanical teeth had pressed inward. His right eye was half-lidded, unfocused, a thin smear of red running down from his brow. His mouth hung slightly open, his lips parted like he had been trying to say something, trying to scream, trying to call out. But there was nothing. Just the soft, dripping noise of blood pooling onto the stage floor. Spring Bonnie stood frozen at Fredbear's side, his empty, soulless eyes gazing forward. Unmoving. Uncaring. Johnny couldn't hear anything. The screaming, the shouting, the sound of Michael sobbing somewhere to his right, it was all muffled, distant, like someone had stuffed cotton in his ears. His vision tunneled. Fredbear's painted-on smile never changed. Still wide. Still grinning. Still happy. Johnny stumbled backward. The lights overhead flickered. And somewhere, beneath the static of the restaurant speakers, a familiar, low mechanical hum filled the air. Johnny barely made it. His legs carried him faster than his mind could process, shoving past the panicked crowd, past the screaming kids, past the adults trying to pull their children away from the horror on stage. His body moved on instinct, his stomach twisting violently with every step. The bathroom door slammed open with a force that sent it bouncing against the tiled wall. Johnny didn't care. He barely even registered it. He collapsed against the stall, shoving the door open, falling to his knees just as his stomach lurched. The vomit hit the toilet water with a sickening splash, burning his throat, his chest convulsing as another wave came up, followed by another. His fingers dug into the porcelain, gripping it for dear life as his entire body heaved. The stench of acid, pizza, and something else, something bitter, something wrong coated his tongue, filled his nose, made him gag even harder. It wouldn't stop. His stomach wouldn't stop. Tears burned at his eyes, hot streaks running down his cheeks as his breath hitched in wet, choking gasps. The image was burned into his skull. Evan's head, cracked open like a broken toy. The blood, so much blood. The way his fingers had twitched just for a second before going completely still. Johnny gripped the toilet harder, his arms trembling as another wretched gag forced its way out. The bathroom was cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the sound too sharp, too wrong in the suffocating silence. His breath shuddered, catching in his throat. He had never seen someone die before. Not like that. Not right in front of him. Another sob tore from his chest. He barely even noticed the bathroom door opening behind him. The bathroom door creaked open behind him, but Johnny didn't move. He couldn't. His stomach was still heaving, his hands gripping the rim of the toilet like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. His entire body shook, a thin layer of sweat clinging to his forehead as he tried to swallow back the lingering taste of bile. A set of slow, unsteady footsteps echoed against the tile floor. Johnny didn't need to turn around to know whoever had entered was just as shaken as he was. The weight of their presence filled the room, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that only came after witnessing something you were never supposed to see. Then a dry gag. Johnny flinched at the sound, his breath catching in his throat. The person behind him, an adult, judging by the weight of their steps, stumbled toward the next stall over. The metal door swung open, and a sickening retch echoed through the room. Johnny's fingers clenched harder against the toilet. Whoever it was, they weren't just queasy. They were sick, just like him. Just like everyone else who had seen what had happened on that stage. A few seconds passed, shaky, gasping breaths between ragged coughs. Then, a weak, broken voice. Jesus Christ. Johnny swallowed thickly, finally forcing himself to turn his head. Through the gaps in the stall doors, he caught a glimpse of the man hunched over the toilet, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the bowl. His breathing was unsteady, his chest rising and falling in uneven gulps of air. Johnny knew him. Henry Emily. One of the owners. The other owner. Not Afton. Henry's hands shook as he pressed them against his face, trying to steady himself, but it wasn't working. His entire body trembled, his shoulders rising and falling with each shuddering inhale. He didn't look like a man who had just witnessed an accident. He looked like a man who had just lost something he could never get back. Johnny's stomach clenched. Afton. He had been there. Hadn't moved. Hadn't reacted. Had just stood there, watching. Johnny swallowed again, his throat raw, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Henry let out another deep, shuddering breath, then leaned back against the stall door, rubbing a hand down his face. His eyes red-rimmed, glassy, staring at the ceiling like he was begging for it to all be some horrible dream, finally flicked toward Johnny. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You saw, didn't you?" Johnny didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. Henry exhaled sharply, his breath ragged, shaky. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, squeezing his eyes shut like he was trying to will the image away. But it wouldn't go. It would never go. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "That boy," his throat bobbed, his jaw tightening as he forced the words out. "Afton." Johnny's stomach twisted, bile still clinging to the back of his throat. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. Henry let out a bitter, choked breath, half a laugh, half something else. Something broken. He ran a shaking hand through his hair, his fingers tangling in the graying strands at his temples. "I knew something was wrong," he muttered, almost to himself. "I knew." He broke off, his voice cracking. His eyes flicked to Johnny again, and for a brief second, it looked like he wanted to say something else. Then, just as quickly, he turned away, bracing himself against the wall like he was struggling to keep himself upright. Johnny swallowed hard. Afton. It was his kid. The boy lying in that growing pool of red, the one Fredbear bit down on, that was his son. But Afton hadn't moved. Hadn't screamed. Hadn't reacted. He had just stood there, watching, like he had been waiting for it to happen. Johnny's skin prickled, his stomach twisting itself into knots all over again. Henry's breathing turned shallow, uneven. He looked sick, wrong, like he wasn't entirely there anymore, like something inside of him had just snapped. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he muttered, "What did he do?" Johnny didn't know if Henry was talking about Afton or himself. Henry let out a breath, long and shaky. His hands were still trembling, his knuckles white where they pressed against the bathroom sink. He hadn't looked up in a while, like he was afraid that if he met his own reflection in the mirror, he'd see something broken staring back. Johnny swallowed the lump in his throat, his own voice weak but steady enough. "You should get out there." Henry finally glanced at him. "What?" Johnny shifted uncomfortably, wiping his clammy palms against his jeans. His stomach still churned, the scent of bile and cold tile clinging to the back of his throat, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over. Not even close. "Henry, right?" Johnny muttered, almost as if he were trying to confirm it for himself. "I don't think William is gonna respond logically to the authorities, I mean." Henry went still. His fingers curled against the porcelain, his shoulders tense, his entire frame locking up like a man who had just been shoved into reality after teetering too close to the edge of something he didn't want to face. His breath left him in a slow, measured exhale. Johnny wasn't even sure why he'd said it. Maybe it was the look on Afton's face, the way he had watched everything unfold with that eerie, unsettling stillness. Maybe it was the way he hadn't moved to stop it, hadn't lunged forward like any normal father would have. Or maybe it was the creeping, twisting sensation in Johnny's gut that told him that this wasn't an accident. Henry's jaw clenched. "You're a smart kid," he said quietly. He turned, rubbing his hands down his face, letting out another unsteady breath. "Too smart." Then, without another word, he straightened his posture, wiped the sweat from his brow, and pushed open the bathroom door. Johnny didn't follow. He stayed there, staring at the empty doorway, listening to the distant chaos outside. Somehow, he knew. This wasn't the worst thing that was going to happen here. Not even close. Johnny stayed in the bathroom, gripping the sink's edge as he forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. His head still swam, his stomach still turned, but his mind, it was clear. Clear in a way it shouldn't have been. Clear in a way that made him understand something no kid his age should. He knew what losing your sanity looked like. And William Afton fit the bill. It wasn't the way he had stood there, motionless, while his son's skull had been crushed inside Fredbear's mouth. It wasn't even the eerie, frozen smirk he had worn before it happened. It was what Johnny had seen after. While the adults panicked, while Henry crumbled, while Michael broke down in terrified sobs, William hadn't moved. He hadn't rushed forward. He hadn't screamed, hadn't shouted, hadn't even reacted. He had just stood there, back straight, hands in his pockets, his head tilted ever so slightly to the side. Watching. His eyes weren't empty. They weren't full of grief, or rage, or anything that made sense for a father who had just watched his son die. They were full of calculation. Like he was already thinking. Already planning. Johnny had seen it before, glimpses of it in his own neighborhood, in his own life. He had seen men come home wrong. with eyes too hollow, with hands that shook even when they thought no one was watching. Men whose minds had fractured, piece by piece, day by day, until there was nothing left inside. Some of them stayed quiet. Some of them snapped. Johnny didn't know which one Afton was. But he knew deep in his gut, in the marrow of his bones, he wasn't a normal man. Not anymore. Maybe he never had been. Afton hadn't lost his sanity in that moment. He had already been losing it. This was just the final push. And Johnny didn't want to be around to see where that would lead. Johnny didn't say a word to anyone as he left. The chaos of the restaurant had become a dull, muffled hum in his ears, the panicked voices, the wailing children, the shrill, desperate cries of Michael Afton, begging his little brother to wake up. It all felt distant, like it wasn't real, like he was moving through a fog. He just needed to go home. He needed to leave this place. His sneakers scuffed against the tile as he made his way toward the exit, his steps slow, careful, almost hesitant. His body still felt shaky, his hands clammy, but his mind kept repeating the same thought over and over again. Something is wrong. More than just the bite. More than just Evan dying. Something else. Something deep. Something that had been waiting to surface. His fingers hovered over the front door handle. But before he could push it open, he felt it. The hairs on his arms stood on end, a deep, cold prickle running up his spine, the unmistakable, instinctive feeling of being watched. Slowly, so slowly, he turned his head. Fredbear. Still on stage. Still soaked in blood. The deep, rich red of Evan's life pooled around his golden fur, dripping down his chin, staining the inside of his open mouth. His joints remained stiff, servos locked, his jaw still partly unhinged as if he were frozen mid-motion, unable to complete his movement. But that wasn't what made Johnny's breath catch in his throat. It was the eyes. They were supposed to be black and white. Plastic. Cold. Lifeless. They weren't. For just a second, one single second, Fredbear's eyes changed. The black void of his pupils filled with something new, something familiar. The whites of his eyes were replaced with a deep, warm brown. The same shade Johnny had seen just before they rolled back into Evan's skull. The same exact color. The breath in Johnny's chest locked. His muscles stiffened, his hands clenched at his sides, his feet refused to move. It was gone just as quickly as it came. The moment passed, blink, and the black and white plastic was back. Like nothing had happened. Like it was never there. But Johnny knew what he saw. His entire body was screaming at him to move, to run, to never come back, to forget every damn thing that had happened that night. Instead, he stood there, staring at the bloody, broken bear, at the thing inside it. And for a brief, fleeting moment, he thought. No. He knew. Evan wasn't gone. Not completely. Johnny's breath hitched. The realization struck him like a jolt of electricity, shooting through his spine, tightening around his ribs like a cold, unseen hand. His fingers twitched at his sides, his heart hammering against his chest, a slow, deep dread settling in his stomach like a heavy stone. Because he wasn't the only one who had seen it. Afton saw it too. Johnny turned his head, barely, just enough to catch a glimpse of the man across the room. William Afton was standing near the stage, his expression unnervingly still. The flashing lights of the arcade cast long, flickering shadows over his features, but Johnny could see it, could feel it in the air around him. Afton knew. His gaze wasn't on the medics scrambling around Evan's limp, broken body. It wasn't on Henry, who had gone deathly pale, his hands shaking violently at his sides. It wasn't even on Michael, who was still on the floor, curled in on himself, sobbing into his trembling hands. Afton was looking at Fredbear. At his eyes. At what was inside. And the worst part? He wasn't shocked. He wasn't horrified. He was interested. Intrigued, even. His lips parted just slightly, his chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths, as though he had just confirmed something. Like he had been waiting for this to happen. Johnny felt his stomach roll, his palms growing cold with sweat. He didn't know what he had just witnessed. Didn't know how Evan's eyes had ended up inside that machine. Didn't know why Fredbear had suddenly felt alive. But Afton did. And something in his posture, something in his expression. He wanted to see more. Johnny's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath shallow, his feet desperate to move but locked in place. Afton knew. Afton had seen it. And the look on his face? It wasn't one of fear. It was curiosity. Johnny needed to leave. Now. His stomach clenched as he turned toward the door again, forcing himself to move, to push past the weight pressing against his chest, to escape the feeling of something crawling beneath his skin. His fingers brushed the door handle. Then he heard it. Soft. Quiet. Barely above a whisper. But it was real. A low, mechanical hum. Fredbear. Humming a tune. The same tune Johnny had heard that night. Before everything went wrong. He ran. Johnny ran the whole way home. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't dare give himself time to think. He needed distance, needed to put as much space between himself and that place as possible. When he finally burst through the front door, he didn't bother turning on the lights. Didn't go to the kitchen. Didn't even glance at the clock. He just went straight to his room, locked the door, and collapsed onto his bed, face buried in his pillow, body trembling with something deep, something he couldn't put into words. His mom would find out soon enough. Lancaster wasn't that big. The news crews would be at Freddy's before the sun even thought about setting. By the time she got home, the radio would be buzzing, the TV flashing the story across every local station. Tragedy at local pizzeria. Child fatally injured in malfunctioning animatronic. She'd ask if he was okay. She'd ask if he had seen it happen. He'd say no. He wasn't going to explain. How could he? What could he even say? I saw a ghost. No. Not a ghost. He saw Evan. What remained of him? A soul trapped, clinging to something it shouldn't. The word bubbled up in his mind, crawling through his thoughts like something whispered from just behind his ear. Remnant. Is that what it was called? When something stayed behind. When a soul couldn't let go. His breath hitched, his stomach curling in on itself. Because if that was true, if that was what had happened to Evan, then why wasn't William Afton shocked? Why wasn't he horrified? Why wasn't he on his knees, crying for his son, screaming in grief, demanding answers? Why was he just standing there, watching, calculating, like a man who had seen something he had been waiting for? Johnny turned onto his side, pulling the blanket over his head, curling in on himself like it might make the thoughts stop. But they wouldn't. They couldn't. Because what he had seen in Afton's eyes wasn't sadness. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even confusion. It was intrigue. And somehow, Johnny knew. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Johnny stayed curled up under the blanket, gripping the fabric so tightly his fingers ached. The darkness behind his eyelids wasn't enough to block out the images burned into his mind. No matter how hard he tried, they wouldn't leave. The blood. The sickening crack. The way Evan's fingers twitched before going still. The hum. The eyes. The remnant. That was the word. He didn't know how he knew it. He had never heard it before. It just came to him, a whisper at the back of his mind, crawling into his skull like it had been waiting for him to understand. Remnant. A soul that couldn't move on. A piece of someone left behind. That's what Evan was now. That's what Johnny had seen. But the real question wasn't why it happened. It was why Afton wasn't surprised. That image wouldn't leave him either. Afton standing there, back straight, eyes locked onto Fredbear like he had just discovered something new. There was no grief. No panic. No horror. Just interest. Johnny had seen people break before. He had seen the way grief hollowed a man out, how it shattered them, how it left them looking like ghosts of themselves. Afton wasn't broken. He wasn't devastated. He was thinking. Johnny rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling, his stomach still twisted in knots. Was this what he wanted? The idea was insane, but the longer he thought about it, the more it made sense. Afton should have fallen to his knees, screaming, begging, doing something. But he hadn't. No, he had watched. He had observed. Like he had been waiting for this moment. Like he had expected it. Johnny shuddered, rubbing his arms as if that would chase away the sick, ice-cold feeling creeping through his veins. Afton knew. He knew what had happened to Evan. And worse than that, he wanted to understand it. The realization sat like a weight on Johnny's chest. His fingers clenched around the blanket again, his throat tight. This wasn't over. It wasn't just a freak accident. It wasn't random. Something was wrong. Something big. And Afton? He was at the center of it. Johnny didn't sleep that night. He tried. He laid in bed, body curled into itself, blanket pulled over his head like it could shield him from the thoughts clawing at his brain. But his eyes wouldn't stay closed. Every time he drifted too far, every time his mind slipped toward the edges of unconsciousness, it dragged him back, the images, the sounds, the feeling. The crunch of bone. The wet, dragging sound of blood pooling on the stage. The twitch of Evan's fingers before they went still. The hum. The way Fredbear's eyes changed. The way Afton watched. Johnny sat up, rubbing his face, his hands still cold, still clammy even though his room was warm. His throat was dry, his mouth bitter with the taste of vomit that still hadn't completely faded. His eyes flicked to the clock on his bedside table. 4:27 a.m. He didn't remember when he had gotten home. He didn't remember what time he had collapsed onto his bed. It all blurred together in a tangled mess of panic and nausea and something else, something he couldn't put into words. He knew his mother would be up in a few hours. She would turn on the radio, flip on the television, and the news would be there. Local child fatally injured at Freddy's Pizzeria. The reporters would talk about the tragedy, the way it had shaken the town. People would be interviewed. Everyone would say the same thing: how horrible it was, how unthinkable, how impossible. No one would mention what Johnny had seen. No one would talk about the way Evan's soul had stayed behind. No one would talk about the way Fredbear had looked at him. And definitely no one would mention the way Afton had stared at that animatronic, like a scientist observing an experiment, like a man who had just found proof of something he had only theorized about before. Johnny gritted his teeth, pulling his knees up to his chest. He didn't know what to do with this. He couldn't do anything. No one would believe him. He was just a kid. And even if someone did listen, what would he even say? I saw Evan's soul inside Fredbear. I saw something that shouldn't be possible. No one would believe it. But Afton knew. And that was what terrified Johnny the most. Because Afton wasn't crying. He wasn't broken, he wasn't mourning. He had seen what Johnny had seen, and instead of screaming, instead of breaking down, instead of reacting like a father who had just lost his child, he had smiled. Just for a second. Just a flicker. But Johnny had seen it. A moment of quiet, pleased realization. And now Johnny knew deep in his gut, in a way that made his stomach coil and his breath turn shallow, this wasn't over. Not even close. This was just the beginning. Johnny sat there, gripping the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded against his ribs, his breath slow but unsteady. His mind was racing, his thoughts a tangled mess of images and realizations, but one thing cut through the noise like a razor. Afton. Something was wrong with Afton. Johnny had seen it in his eyes, the way he didn't panic, the way he watched as if he had just confirmed something. The way his lips had barely, just barely, pulled into a smile before he wiped it away. He had seen what Johnny saw. And now Johnny knew William Afton wasn't just another grieving father. He wasn't mourning Evan. He was interested. Johnny clenched his jaw, his fingers digging into his blanket. His pulse thudded in his ears as a realization settled deep in his chest. He couldn't just sit here. He had to know. He had to find out what Afton was up to. The thought came fast, sharp, without hesitation. He had never been the kind of kid to get involved in things that weren't his business. He had never been reckless. Never gone looking for trouble. But this wasn't something he could ignore. He threw off the blanket and moved, fast, before he could talk himself out of it. His body was still shaking, but his mind was clear. He grabbed his sneakers, shoved them on without bothering to tie them properly, and cracked open his bedroom door. The house was still dark, silent except for the steady ticking of the clock in the hallway. His mother was asleep. She always slept like a rock. If he was quiet, she wouldn't wake up. He crept down the stairs, barely breathing, stepping over the spots he knew would creak. Then, just like that, he was out the front door. The night air hit him like a slap, cool against his sweat-damp skin. The street was mostly empty, the only light coming from the flickering street lamps and the occasional passing car. He took off running. His feet pounded against the pavement, his breath coming in quick, short bursts. The streets of Lancaster blurred past him, but he didn't stop, didn't slow. He didn't know what he was going to find. But he knew where he had to go. Fredbear's. Even if the cops were still there. Even if the whole place was roped off. Even if he had to sneak in through the back. Afton was up to something. And Johnny was going to find out what. The night was cold, the streets quiet. Lancaster had fallen into that eerie stillness that came after something horrible had happened, the kind of silence that settled deep in the bones of a place, lingering like an unshakable fog. Johnny kept low, his breath coming in short, shallow puffs as he crept along the side of Fredbear's family diner. The cops had been gone for a while now. He had watched them leave from the alley across the street, waiting for the moment the last flashing lights had faded into the distance. The place was dead. No movement inside, no sounds, just the glow of the street lights casting long shadows across the peeling paint and broken pavement of the parking lot. But something felt off. Johnny didn't know what, didn't know why, but the second he got close, the air shifted. Like something was still here. Something that shouldn't be. His heart pounded as he reached the back of the building. The police tape stretched across the doors and windows, its bright yellow color harsh against the brick. Do not cross. Crime scene. Johnny ignored it. His focus was on the window. The one attached to the back room. The glass was dirty, streaked with grime, but he could still see inside. And what he saw made his stomach twist. William Afton was sitting there. Alone. In the dim, flickering light of the small room, hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. He wasn't moving much, just rocking slightly, his fingers laced together, his head tilted. He was staring at something. Johnny followed his gaze. And that's when he saw it. The old spring Bonnie suit. It sat slumped in the chair across from him, its massive frame casting jagged shadows across the walls. The dull, faded yellow fabric was worn and stiff, the material stretched over its metal endoskeleton, the joints rusted, the seams torn in places where the suit had been left to rot. It wasn't like the animatronics in the main room. It didn't have the same glossy, polished look. This thing was old. And wrong. Johnny swallowed hard, watching, waiting, wondering what the hell Afton was doing here. Then Afton laughed. Not loud. Not sudden. It started small, just a quiet chuckle, deep and breathy, like something genuinely funny had just dawned on him. Then it got worse. The laughter grew, rolling from his chest, his shoulders shaking, his head tilting back slightly as he let out a sharp, uneven breath between chuckles. Johnny felt his stomach curl, his skin prickle with cold sweat. This wasn't a man mourning his son. This wasn't the laugh of someone who had lost everything. This was something else. Something dark. Something thrilled. Afton lifted a hand, slowly, pressing his fingers against the spring Bonnie suit's lifeless face. Still laughing. Still grinning. Johnny's breath caught in his throat. He shouldn't be here. He should run. But his feet wouldn't move. Because in that moment, he knew. He didn't just think Afton had been waiting for something. He knew it. And whatever it was, whatever he had just discovered in that moment, he was loving it. Johnny's breath locked in his chest. Afton stood up, slow and deliberate, his fingers lingering on the lifeless face of the spring Bonnie suit as if he were comforting it. His laughter had quieted, but that eerie grin, wide, stretched, almost unnatural, remained fixed on his face. Johnny could only watch, frozen outside the window, his fingers gripping the windowsill so hard his nails dug into the rotting wood. Afton turned toward the suit. And then he opened it. Johnny's stomach twisted as the back of the suit split apart, revealing the inner workings of the old technology. The exposed endoskeleton gleamed under the dim flickering light, a mess of rusted gears, heavy metal joints, and spring locks. Johnny had heard about them before, mostly in passing. The old animatronics from before Freddy's weren't just machines, they were suits, designed for employees to wear. But they weren't safe. Everyone knew that. They were dangerous, unstable. If the locks failed, if something went wrong, Johnny's skin crawled. Afton didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, one foot sliding inside the hulking mass of the suit, his movements smooth, practiced. Like he had done this before. Johnny's breath hitched. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something he was testing. Afton knew what he was doing. He slipped his arms inside the mechanical limbs, his fingers stretching, testing the movement, shifting into the suit like it was a second skin. His breathing was slow, measured, and when he finally fit himself inside, he adjusted. Like he belonged in it. Like it was him. The back panel of the suit clicked shut. The dim, cracked light bulb overhead buzzed, casting flickering shadows across the room. And then Afton moved. The suit jerked forward, then settled. His head turned, the exaggerated, frozen grin of Spring Bonnie now covering his face, those empty, soulless eyes staring straight ahead. Johnny felt his stomach churn. It wasn't Afton anymore. It wasn't a man. It was a monster. A thing. A thing that laughed. Softly. Muffled by the suit's jaw, but still there, still wrong. A sound that didn't belong to a human. A sound that belonged to something else entirely. Johnny ran. Johnny's legs carried him before his mind could fully catch up. The cold air hit him like a slap as he bolted away from the diner, his breath sharp, burning in his throat. His sneakers pounded against the pavement, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a war drum, every part of his body screaming at him to get away, to leave, to never look back. But even as he ran, he knew. He was coming back. Tomorrow night. His stomach twisted violently at the thought. Every instinct, every ounce of survival in his body told him not to, told him that Afton was wrong, that whatever he was doing inside that suit, it wasn't something a normal person should ever see. But Johnny had already seen too much. He had seen Evan's eyes inside Fredbear. He had seen Afton watch it happen, wait for it, enjoy it. And now, he had seen Afton become something else. He wasn't just some grieving father. He wasn't a man who had snapped from the weight of loss. Afton had stepped into that suit like he belonged in it. Like it was his true form. like he had been waiting for an excuse to become something else. And now he had one. Johnny's breath shuddered as he reached his street, slowing to a walk as he glanced around, checking for anyone who might have seen him. The houses were dark, the town quiet, but he still felt watched. Not by his neighbors. Not by cops. Something else. Something with a wide, frozen grin and hollow, soulless eyes. Johnny swallowed hard and forced himself to keep moving, to push forward, to breathe. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, he'd go back. Tomorrow, he'd find out what the hell Afton was doing in there. Because he knew. Somehow, deep down, he knew. This wasn't over. This was just beginning.